According to some critics, monster erotica is the reason modern literature has descended into degeneracy.
The perversion factor, as with adult content across the board, intensifies over time. And all of this increasingly weird and increasingly perverted stuff is all filtering through to the mainstream. All these weird monster and animal smut books like Morning Glory Milking Farm.
Who knew what she'd do next in her frenzied state? I'm sorry, officer. I didn't mean to fillet this minotaur in the middle of the dining room. But you see, he's been playing so fucking hard to get that I snapped.
These critics blame the increasingly mainstream genre of romancing gargoyles, werewolves, and orcs for the perceived downward trajectory of the medium.
The truth is, there's a lot of interest for this kind of thing.
This is unironically female porn. That is what it is.
Yes,
of
course.
Yes. But it's a response to like current wave feminism, is that you push men so far into like cuckdom that you can't stand them and want nothing to do with them, so they have to read books of like extreme
about a cow.
You know, it's amazing. You are 100% wrong. I mean, nothing you've said has been right.
These people are, of course, hyperbolic crybabies, or ignorant perhaps intentionally, of trends that have been spreading throughout romance and literature since arguably the first story was ever written, or at least the oldest we have anyway. The Epic of Gilgamesh is, after all, centered on a relationship between a man and a monster. Gilgamesh and Enkidu are pitted against one another before slowly coming to understand the other, fighting alongside as brothers, until ultimately Enkidu dies in Gilgamesh's arms.
He touched his heart, but it did not beat, nor did he lift his eyes again. When Gilgamesh touched his heart, it did not beat. So Gilgamesh laid a veil, as one veils the bride, over his friend.
Now, some might read lines such as that and, read them as close friends. You see, I read them, though, a little different.
Maybe it's time to take this bull by the horns.
That's just my perspective, though. I mean, it's your mileage will vary on that one. Throughout fiction, we have seen monsters and humans interact, sometimes as antagonistic predatory forces, but other times not so much.
Werewolf or hot devil man?
Well, I'm definitely going to werewolf. I think for me it's close enough that it doesn't really matter. The werewolf wins this time.
Yippee!
Let's just push aside any conversation about taste. This is not going to be a video about what I like or don't like to read. What I am offering you in this video is not my opinion or my reading preference, it is facts.
Some critics, such as Second Story, aka Hilary Lane, claim that the proliferation of sexual content in women's fiction has in general degraded the medium.
And the first thing we need to establish is that all this so-called romance fiction and most, if not all, of the current women's literature out there is not women's literature. It's... The issue here is probably one of the oldest ones in existence. It's the normalization of explicit adult entertainment. Whether it's women or men who are trying to do that is pretty irrelevant, because the number one reason anyone has ever tried to normalize this kind of explicit content is money. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. First of all, we need to establish this fact very, very clearly. Women's literature is not, just some randomly horny trend in the book industry. In that sense, outside of a handful of odd entries here and there, women's literature doesn't exist. Women haven't taken over the literary world. A four-letter word starting with P has taken over the literary world. Barnes & Noble and every other major and independent bookseller, especially all those new romance bookshops, have now just become another kind of adult entertainment store. And no, that's not a good thing.
Huh. I've heard that before, haven't I?
This is unironically female porn. That is what it is.
Yes!
I didn't realize that Second Story and Chativersity had the same politics, but I guess they do. You learn something new every day, huh?
A quick perusal of the book recommendation section of the romance books subreddit will destroy any remaining illusions you might have had that these books are about anything other than sexual arousal. Just take a moment and look at some of these. Can you honestly say that this attitude towards women's fiction has to do with anything other than sex?
At worst, she claims that this proliferation of media results in personal pain for the readership, including, them being,
I spent a little time while I was researching this subject talking to women and reading the accounts of women who were struggling with the addiction to hardcore content. A solid 90 to 95% of them started with erotic fiction, or smut, as they often called it, and fan fiction. A few stated that they didn't really ever get into videos, often because videos couldn't feed their precise needs. Several mentioned that they had quit the video content only to fall back on erotic fiction, and had happily arrived at the realization that there was functionally no difference between the two. I read an account from one woman who noted that she preferred written smut because within books and fan fiction she was able to find things that would have been illegal in video form. So that's nice. I learned too that there was a worryingly large subset of these women, some as young as 17, whose tastes became so depraved so quickly that they were now suffering from something called POCD. I'll let you look that one up yourself.
I'll save you the Google. She's saying that reading hardcore smut makes women pay. Of course, Hillary refuses to actually cite any sources because she has no sources for this.
Another interesting thing to note, if you're not yet sold on the fact that all of this so-called women's lit is little more than, four-letter word starts with P, have a look at how much women's fiction has become subject to categorization norms that you don't see outside like the hub or fan fiction, which has become just another form of debauched adult entertainment. Sure, yeah, okay, fan fiction that isn't smut does theoretically exist, I guess, but that's like saying there are non-explicit OnlyFans creators.
Ah yes, such insidious tags like queer romance, lesbian, arranged marriages, caretaking, enemies to lovers, grumpy and sunshine. Really, this is what you're afraid of, Hillary? By the way, if you want to hear her entire complaining about fanfiction and all that, I have another video all about that topic previously, but I want to hone in on one specific thing. The idea that fiction before Sarah J. Maas and all that wasn't explicit.
Let's take Sarah J. Maas, for example. I shouldn't have to tell you who she is and why she's relevant to this conversation, but if you don't know, let me just say that she's the woman responsible for the series of books commonly referred to as...
I have some bad news for you on that one, Hillary. There's always been a history of sultry temptation or erotic monstrosities in folklore, in literature, and mythology. There's the Lamia Queen in Final Fantasy II, who tries to seduce Firion. There's Carmilla, the vampire seductress who lures young women to her bosom and her fangs. In Greek myth, Zeus would transform into a beast to mate, usually forcefully mate, with human women, while his wife's back was turned, of course. There are numerous stories about entities that give birth to monsters, like the Greek echidna, not to be confused with Knuckles the echidna, by the way.
Look at you, you who were once so proud. Go now and never return.
A half-woman, half-serpent monster who mated with Typhon to create many of mythology's greatest monsters, most notably Cerberus, the guardian of Hades. There's also one that Lovecraft made with a name that borders on a certain word with a hard R. This even had an impact on actual physical conditions we felt in real life. Sleep paralysis was conflated with the arrival of the succubus or incubus, pressing their bodies against you as they vampirically drain you of bodily fluids through intercourse. Hell, even the Bible itself has interspecies crossbreeding. As early as the first few chapters of Genesis, we learn in those first few chapters that prior to Noah's Ark, human women mated with the angels who guarded them to produce the Nephilim. And I remind you, we're talking about biblically accurate angels, so it's not like Sephiroth, we're talking about the wheels with the eyes and all that kind of stuff. So they're mating not with this, but with this. But all that feels distinct from the modern trends of monster romance, right? They feel fundamentally different in some way. Well, to help figure out the difference between the classical and the modern, I reached out to a friend with first-hand experience editing and writing monster romance stories.
I'm Charlie Knight. I edit fiction and nonfiction for self-published authors across all genres. I also edit TTRPGs. I'm a gamer, I'm an author, I'm a reader, of course. And I'm here because Ant knows I have a deep fondness for all things monster related.
Now, while this video is not sponsored, I would encourage you to donate to Charlie's Ko-fi or Patreon page to receive further writing advice or more, as well as help them pay for their medical treatments. Every little cent goes a long way, and I want to make sure my friends are taken care of. So links to both are in the descriptions below. So first and foremost, what counts as a monster romance? Well, simply put, it's a romance story that puts a human being with a monster, usually drawing from horror, fantasy, or sci-fi fiction to some capacity.
Whoa, hey! In terms of the popular monsters, we've always seen a ton of popularity with vampires, gargoyles, I think because a lot of us grew up with a certain cartoon.
I've wanted to stroll down a city street with you for a long time.
Orcs have always been super prominent. Werewolves and other shifters. Usually, if we're looking at the very popular end of it, they're like dog, cat related shifters. Ghosts and spirits have been coming up pretty quickly. Demons and devils are always a big one. People love to do their religious trauma. I'm seeing more things with tentacles becoming more common and more popular now. There's a lot more like adventure being taken with more mythological monsters. So we are seeing more sirens, things like that. Even more like biblically accurate representations of certain monsters. Definitely Eldritch horrors are coming up. I feel like the more marginalized the author gets, the more creative the take on the monster in the story will get, and the more far from the norm that will get. There's more of a willingness to branch out and just be weird, be dark. So we're definitely seeing some more really creative things happening. I would love to see more aliens. It's not, I can't say that I'm seeing a huge shift in that direction yet. I would really like to, but it has not been brought out into the mainstream or brought to me yet, unfortunately.
That's pretty extreme, Commander.
And the genre is much older than you might think. Obviously, interspecies relationships in genre fiction have been a thing for a while. I mean, Captain Kirk in every American home would make out with just about every single alien around, a track record copied and parodied by other sci-fi heroes, such as Marvel's Star-Lord.
Comic sorcery!
Star Trek would often bring in alien romances that played with social convention. One example that comes to mind early on is from Next Generation, the episode The Outcast. Riker develops feelings for Soren, an alien from the Janai race, a species that rejects the concept of gender entirely. This is of course something that Ursula K. Le Guin in The Left Hand of Darkness did much better in the 60s when the original Star Trek was airing, but I digress. It turns out Soren is interested in the concept of gender and sex, and especially sex with Riker. But because Saurian society rejects these concepts, Soren is taken and forced to undergo conversion therapy, which the episode arguably allows to happen unchallenged. And it's kind of half-assed with those messages, and many people involved with the episode, including Jonathan Frakes, who plays Riker, point out the message would be much stronger about gender and orientation and acceptance if a male actor played Soren instead of a female actor. But, I want you to put this in the back of your mind. This will come back later. The idea of monster romances playing a role in telling marginalized stories in a time when that was not acceptable. One recurring thing with critics discussing monster romance is they'll often focus on the impact it has on the fantasy genre.
Yes. It's important that we stay on top of what's happening in the culture, I'm just saying. And this is what is currently happening in the fantasy genre.
Oh my god.
Yeah, oh my god.
We should have a read along.
This is now basically the entire best-selling fantasy chart.
Read
Since
it.
Men got banned from the industry. It's all there. When George R. R. Martin was doing an interview with another writer, they spoke about this. He said, like to keep update on the charts. He says they're all this, and it's all women reading these books. Not a lot of consent in those books. And it's like,
what's George talking about?
George is going to make one of these books. He was really excited about the sales numbers.
The truth is, there's a lot of interest for this kind of thing, and when you look around, like at some of like the fan fiction type of stuff, like the sites that are dedicated to fan fiction that come out of these different worlds. It is all a lot of this stuff, and it's aimed at certain types of women, and like so many of them have like Draco raping Hermione, but then her falling in love with him and shit like that. There's a lot of stuff like that out there.
Ryan Kinnell saying that. That sounds familiar.
To categorization norms that you don't see outside like the hub or fan fiction, which has become just another form of debauched adult entertainment. Sure, yeah, okay, fan fiction that isn't smut does theoretically exist, I guess, but that's like saying there are non-explicit OnlyFans creators.
But let's get back to this fear that monster romance is overtaking fantasy as a genre. First off, no. While Morning Glory Milking Farm is a bestseller in the erotica genre, it is not a bestseller in the general fantasy tag. But they present this as reflective of modern fantasy in order to pretend that the genre is somehow in flux, in danger. Because they're probably more interested in fantasy. But nowhere was the interspecies relationship more prominent than in horror fiction. Horror stories have conflated sexual maturity and eroticism with monsters for ages. Vampires and werewolves especially. A lot of people point to the raw eroticism of Anne Rice's works, but those vampires are very humanized. Even though they are monsters, they're people. That said, I think the idea of the monster becoming an allegory for maturity is best seen with the character of Claudia, who was turned to a vampire as a child. Despite aging intellectually, her body is stunted as a child's body, and the inherent struggle she deals with as a result of this leads to her downfall over the course of that first novel. But to show something more monstrous that's erotic, something that's more alien in so many ways, we go to Angela Carter. Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber is a second-wave feminist reinterpretation of classic fairy tales. And its adaptation, The Company of Wolves, it felt like an off-brand fairy tale movie, let you half remember, and your dreams fill in the blanks. And it's really a lot like that. It's enchanting, but also haunting. And I feel that we do a disservice to ourselves when we ignore it in the larger conversations, both of monster romances and all that, but also of horror fiction, I think. And werewolf fiction especially. It's rarely brought up. Company of Wolves conflates the restrictive worldview of isolated childhood and the realities of adult life to the worldview of fairy tales. Remain shackled to what your Angela Lansbury grandmother tells you, or let the adult werewolf erotically take you, young child. That's a little weird, I think, actually, now I think about it.
You are a fast mover. Please have a seat right there.
Ginger Snaps and The Howling would also conflate eroticism with unibrow werewolves. Okay, maybe not the unibrow part, but the werewolf certainly. With The Howling's intercourse transformation scene, yes, that is a thing I just said, and Ginger Snap's puberty allegory for werewolfism. Something years later, Jennifer's Body would also do, with a few extra doses of bisexuality and surprisingly less blood than Ginger Snaps. Like, a lot less blood. Ginger Snaps is a very bloody movie. Sometimes the scariest horror can be unstated, such as in Saya no Uta, a visual novel by the same guys made Madoka, which focuses on a young man who sees everything in the world as though it was some gory, fleshy nightmare, until he lays his eyes on one little girl who looks completely normal. The only problem is, everyone else who sees her loses their minds, which begs the question, what is this girl? Why does she seem to like our protagonist? And why is our protagonist the only one who doesn't go mad looking upon her visage? Of course, make no mistake, most often, monsters are seen as a hazard, a danger, a threat. But even in this, there's still a degree of eroticism, though dangerous.
How's this for a wet dream?
But sometimes, eroticism of the grotesque is a driving factor in the narrative. The Untamed is a Mexican film from 2016 focusing on a group of deeply unhappy, deeply frustrated people who turn to an alien locked in a barn for any semblance of pleasure. This, of course, ends, well, how do you expect? For some creators, though, this mix of horror and eroticism is the core appeal of what they do.
I love Dracula.
What do you love about him?
Well, hey, this guy lives forever. Gets to pick up girls by just glancing at them.
But he kills them. He kills them.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean he's a bad person.
In the case of Clive Barker's work, eroticism is usually some core factor at play with everything, pushing the conflict forward. Barker connects splatterpunk into grotesque with deep eroticism. Nowhere is that more clear or more disturbing than in Hellraiser.
You solved the box. We came. Now you must come with us. Taste our pleasures.
The Cenobites are explorers of pleasure, yeah, and they're the main guys who take all the attention, but they're not the star of the story, nor are they even the core characters, or even the core villains of the story. That goes to Julia and Frank. Hellraiser is the story of Julia, who had an affair with her now husband's brother. The husband's brother, Frank, got sucked to hell by the Cenobites because he opened up the lament configuration, and now he's clawing his way back. If Julia wants to have another night with Frank, Frank needs blood, because the only way to reconstitute his flesh is by draining the living of their bodily fluids. The main motivation of Frank and Julia is the pursuit of eroticism. Frank's seen everything and wants to experience something even more, but bit off more than he can chew, while Julia wants another night with the man who gave her immense pleasure after a dissatisfying marriage. Eroticism is the core drive of that plot, and Frank looks like this for most of the film. Yeah, a monster, both in terms of the external and the interior. What Hellraiser does so well is it externalizes the interior evils of the characters, turning normal people into ghouls. In the 2000s, monster romance became a mainstream discussion point in sci-fi games, with Mass Effect. Commander Shepard, your main character, can romance multiple characters, including a couple aliens, depending on the choices you make and what gender you choose. Liara, for example, though, is a more human-looking alien, so people didn't raise too many eyebrows with that. But when Garrus came around, well, strangely enough, I think Garrus is the most popular romance option for female Shepard. Maybe it's because I just talk to people who love Garrus so much, like Charlie here. Yeah, I will call you out, Charlie, you fucking nerd. The practice of video games allowing both multiple love interests as well as non-human love interests is so common now, people don't even think about it all that much. But when it first happened, it was a little controversial.
Mass Effect is what it's called. It's made for Microsoft's Xbox system, and it features in some parts of this, you'll see full digital nudity. Imagine. And the ability for the players to engage in graphic sex, and the person who's playing the game gets to decide exactly what's going to happen between the two people, if you know what I mean. Now, the game is rated M for mature. However, critics say that Mass Effect is being marketed to kids and to teenagers. Kids have access to these things, and unless you're hovering over them every second, they're going to find ways to see this stuff on the internet. How damaging is it really?
Well, the thing is, it's the whole concept of, like, 13-year-olds have never seen Playboy because they're not supposed to. It's that idea that, let's talk about who the video game is for. It might be for adults, but if you look at the statistics, who is playing video games but adolescent males, not their dads? So that's the first thing. The damage is this. We know that all the research shows that violence has a desensitizing effect. Well, sexuality does too, because this is when the developing mind is happening. This is when they're first deciding who they're going to be, who their identity is. This is when social development is happening. And here's how they're seeing women. They're seeing them as these objects of desire, as these, hot bodies. I mean, they don't show women as being valued for anything other than their sexuality. And it's a man in this game deciding how many women he wants to be with.
All right, let's get Jeff in on this.
All right, that's
go ahead,
completely
Jeff.
Incorrect. Yeah, it's completely incorrect. First of all, you can actually play as a man or a woman in the game. Cooper, have you ever played Mass Effect?
No.
Oh, wow. Where have I heard this before?
There was a worryingly large subset of these women, some as young as 17, whose taste became so depraved so quickly that they were now suffering from something called POCD. I'll let you look that one up yourself.
I think the only difference here is that when this happened 15 years ago, gamers actually stood up for the game in question.
One of the bigger news events of the week that just keeps growing has been the reaction to Fox News' coverage of the well-documented sex scene that can occur within BioWare's Mass Effect. Apparently, it was Martin Luther King Day, and no longer satisfied with live shots from Atlanta, Fox News decided to debate the most important issue of the day, the corrupting influence of an act of virtual intimacy in a game intended for adults and available since late November. The ensuing spectacle was nothing short of an act of journalistic prurience, where a litany of falsehoods about the game were detailed by the anchor and, quote, psychology expert Cooper Lawrence, who happily admitted to never playing the game herself. The only empirical expert to contradict these claims was Jeff Keighley, who was not only patronized, but wasn't even afforded the simple courtesy of equal time to set the record straight.
Date Everything is a mainstream game from this past year, where you can date every single item in your house that's now personified as a human, including an edgy boy who worships shadows, who is the personification of Shadow, as well as the personification of your worst nightmares. Of course, Betty is best girl, none of these guys come close, don't even at shock me. This also includes mainstream hits like Baldur's Gate 3, where you can romance many characters, including, but not limited to, an elven druid who can turn into a bear when in heat, a demonic-looking but kind-hearted tiefling named Karlach, 3 guesses who I romanced first, you can never guess, I'm sure, or the vampiric Astarion, a character who I genuinely think people romance to work out their weird feelings they got when watching Jim Henson's Labyrinth as a kid.
Next time, just warn me before you do something stupid.
Go back to your room. Play with your toys and your costumes.
Charlie, be honest. When playing Baldur's Gate 3, because I know you've played that game, you romanced the Emperor, didn't you?
Yes.
Of course.
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely.
Of course I did.
Oh,
There's no doubt. Yes.
No, 100%. I wasn't even questioning that, quite honestly.
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings also introduced the idea of relationships between humans and elves, yes, and that became very popular here on out. Dungeons & Dragons would feature the half-elf and half-orc, and early on in D&D lore, these characters were often produced by, well, less than consensual relationships. But this has shifted over time to be more inclusive. Assault is a common justification for interspecies hybrid characters, which adds an element of disturbing violation to the whole mix. Not romance, but violence. With it being so prevalent, it also gives the impression that these relationships are, by their own very nature, taboo and unethical. Any product of this relationship is a miracle birthed from horror. One of the most stereotypical half-elf characters ever, Tanis Half-Elven from the Dragonlance novels, is the offspring of Assault. At least, sometimes. It gets murkier, there's retcons, sometimes it's Assault, other times the relationship was a result of Stockholm Syndrome. Romances involving elves and other creatures like that are often relegated to the Romantasy genre, which I think is kind of like an umbrella term under which monster romance falls under. Unless you have like really fucked up elves. Undeniably, Romantasy has a huge presence in modern publishing, we'll get to that, but I think there's a working way you can look at mainstream Romantasy and funnel it down to monster romance specifically.
I think the biggest difference comes in when we do look at that, at the horror appeal of it, and also at the eroticism aspect. Romantasy is so broad and can take on, 1,000 different things within it. One romantasy story and the next don't necessarily have to look anything alike. Monster romance can fit into Romantasy. We could consider some monster romance stories part of Romantasy. It's just so much of a broader scope. And again, we have to be considering the actual monster aspect of it, where you can have a very soft elf romance and call that Romantasy. You're not going to turn around and call that monster romance because we do want to account for the horror and the eroticism.
But are there any authors who are close to both, that thread the needle between the two?
Welcome back! Our next guest is a New York Times best-selling fantasy author known for the wildly popular series The Folk of the Air and the Spiderwick Chronicles. In total, she has sold more than 26 million books. That's a lot of books. Her latest book is called The Prisoner's Throne, and it's out now. Everybody say hello to Holly Black.
So Holly Black is a YA fantasy author, now more mixed adult YA. Holly Black's Tithe was published in 2002, and it kicked off a trilogy of fairy tale books. Now, Black wrote a lot of really good works for a while, including the Spiderwick Chronicles, which you probably read more likely than not as a kid. But what's important is that years later, she wrote The Cruel Prince, which, alongside Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Thorns and Roses, sparked a lot of interest in the modern Romantasy cycle. However, while A Court of Thorns and Roses has fairies, they're kind of like basically just people, and they're more overtly erotic and very spicy, but they're also safe. There's nothing truly alien about Maas's fae. The Cruel Prince's fae are very bizarre, and they're darker, and they're more alien. They're more monstrous, more old folklore. I think that helped push people down a pipeline of sorts to more intense monster romances. Ice Planet Barbarian by Ruby Dixon, a series consisting of 22 novels written between 2015 and 2021, self-published. The books were then later republished by Berkeley Books in 2021 after TikTok elevated the series to popularity during the pandemic. They had a lot of time on their hands to read. That's not to say that monster romances materialized at that time. It's just that the genre became mainstream around that time. Monster romance books were already a hot topic in book publishing spaces all the way back in 2014. You just didn't hear about it. With the self-publishing boom of the 2010s, books of all sorts began to flood the Amazon marketplace, with special attention going to works that mainstream publishing didn't think there was a market for. They didn't publish them, they didn't accept them, because these were weird esoteric books that no one wanted to read. They believed. Joke's on them though now, if people really did want to read them. However, among these independent authors, there's one that I think really stands out, that I think really helped elevate the acceptance of monster romance specifically, and that's Chuck Tingle. Tingle's now legendary career started back in 2014, where he made several gay monster erotica parody stories. He's the Weird Al of this genre, I feel, that reach increasingly absurd degrees of abstractness and bizarrety. Books such as My Billionaire Triceratops Craves My Gay Ass, Pounded by President Bigfoot, and Taken by the Gay Unicorn Biker. I get these fucking titles, man. Becoming titles so fucking ridiculous that Cracked.com basically worshipped the guy. They had rankings of the most absurd Chuck Tingle books, because they were just, what the fuck are these? These titles sounded completely like ridiculous word salad generated out of nowhere. Tingle can best be described as a left-wing troll in all the best ways. I love this guy. He is ridiculous. In 2016, he got nominated for a Hugo Award. Yes, the Hugo Award, which is like the Academy Awards for sci-fi fantasy, by the Rabid Puppies, an offshoot of the Sad Puppies, which can best be described as Gamergate for sci-fi books. And Gamergate, by the way, was a group that got angry over the Zoe Quinn, game developer, maybe trading favors for good reviews, morphed into an alt-right culture war army that apparently now we found out is possibly spearheaded in part by Jeffrey Epstein, so that's interesting. The Sad Puppies believed that mainstream sci-fi was becoming too focused on diversity and feminism and racial minorities and LGBTQIA themes, and their goal was to destroy the Hugo Awards because they saw that as a representative of all that was wrong with sci-fi publishing, I guess. And to do that, the Rabbit Puppies founder, Vox Day, who is a literal neo-Nazi, pushed to get Chuck Tingle nominated, because he figured that if Chuck Tingle was nominated, it would show how absurdly useless the Hugos were. What value are these awards if trash like Tingle could be nominated? But Tingle saw through them. He recognized what they were putting down, and decided to troll them back by saying if he won the award, Zoe Quinn would accept the award for him. Zoe Quinn being the one woman they hated above all else. So, in trying to troll the Hugos, Tingle trolled all them back. And then later on, got nominated anyway without the assistance of neo-Nazis. And he lost both times. He has never won a Hugo Award, but he has written books about making love with his hypothetical Hugo Award. Though I'd be doing a disservice to Tingle if I did not also mention he is now a USA Today best-selling author. Yes, really. And also, due to him showing up in one of H. Bomber Guy's charity streams back in 2019, he has also showed up in the same event as AOC. This guy's life, man. What is this? So despite people first reading him for the bit, he is now a legitimately talented, respected author who has done a lot of good for society. And he's a troll. I want to make sure that gets clear. With Tingle, people started reading him because his work was so ridiculous that you had this morbid fascination. How ridiculous could it get? And also short, so you can read them in 5 seconds, basically. I think some of them like 10 pages long. 20 pages long, very short books. But then people actually started to enthusiastically enjoy and champion his work. I think it's indicative of a lot of monster romance in general. People are drawn to the sheer audacity of these books. But once they start reading them, they realize they kind of like them. Maybe because they're so stupid you have to make fun of them, or because there's something there that draws you in. Maybe they're just good stories.
People who are buying erotic fiction for their Kindle are looking to be satisfied in all senses of that word. They want to be satisfied as readers of fiction with exciting and intriguing stories, and they want to be satisfied sexually, which is why they're buying erotic fiction in the first place. I don't think those who like mythological beings are fundamentally different from those who buy any other flavor of erotica. That's like asking if people who satisfy their hunger with Thai food are somehow different from those who prefer Italian.
However, pushes were made to censor extreme books that dealt with humans behaving erotically with non-human characters. In short, monster romances and furry novels got roped in with stories about, well...
But I'm just not naive enough to believe that there's no such thing as an animal that can enjoy having sex with a human being.
Something a little more illegal, and were taken off of Amazon as a result in bulk.
After a media storm surrounding the availability of ebooks featuring and bestiality through major retailers like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Waterstones, things started to change. Authors of fantasy erotica found their books taken off the virtual shelf with little or no explanation. Although Amazon has been vague on what literature it deems offensive, even when talking to Business Insider, many of the writers and folks tracking this issue suspect that these ebooks got caught in Amazon's net because they involve sex with non-human entities and are therefore taboo.
However, monster romance writers found ways to work around this. Make it clear the stories are about romancing werewolves. And that's different from romancing Airbud.
There is some discussion of questions of bestiality, especially when involving creatures with human-like intelligence, and consent in fiction, but some of the authors have been able to get their books back on Amazon by upgrading their cover art or giving their books Hoyer titles.
Of course, none of this changes the fact that the average critic will still draw comparisons to dismiss the genre as a whole.
Of like extreme
about a cow.
Yeah.
Man.
Because they want to feel something. They want to feel like that raw, visceral, like primal instinct because they think all men are like incapable.
You mean
of,
masculinity? They want their masculinity back. Okay.
Well,
A
lot of
control.
like, when you see a minotaur, it's not a minotaur, it's a cow. When you see a werewolf, it's not a monstrous werewolf, it's a dog. And this stereotype has kind of caused issues with monster romance writers for a very long time, even though the distinction, I think, is very obvious between a giant monster that is human and man's best friend.
Frankly, I'm really frustrated by it. That mindset is part of the reason why monster romance writers have to make specific choices. For like example, if you wanted to write a monster romance with a dragon, you basically have to create a very humanoid or somehow dragon shifter in order to escape Amazon's rules. I don't think it takes a lot of critical thinking to get to the reality, though, because we know the difference between something that is even in part humanoid and even in part an animal. There is a big difference between a dog and a dog shifter, between something that can change form and speak to you and has emotions that we can relate to as people. We're not anthropomorphizing animals. It's an entirely different realm when we're dealing with monsters. Some of them are going to be more animalistic. Some may not have all capabilities of humans in terms of like talking, walking, the number of ways that we communicate, things like that. But there will be humanistic, recognizable, universal things that we have in common with these monsters. I don't think it takes a lot of thought to realize that this is not an entirely different thing happening.
And despite any protests there might be from critics, there's undeniably a market for it. And even mainstream films have used elements of monster romance to promote what is ostensibly mainstream entertainment.
Sony's Chinese marketing team apparently went with the direction of what a great boyfriend Venom would make, rather than his gruesome look or man-eating capabilities. The cartoon adverts display the uses which a Venom boyfriend would make, such as carrying a load of shopping bags, taking perfect selfies, holding an umbrella, and simply keeping you safe on the underground train network.
But there's two stories I omitted, right? And they were both up for Best Picture at the Oscars. One even won, actually. In 1991, Disney released Beauty and the Beast. The film had been in the works in some way, shape, or form since the Walt Disney era, but they couldn't crack the story, at least not perfectly. Sure, there was the French version in the 40s that was arguably the second most famous version of the story, and then there was the 80s version that was also really good, but the 90s one by Disney is the best, or at least most widely liked. Also, Angela Lansbury, you're here too. Huh, that's weird, it happened twice. It's a story about seeing true beauty from within rather than without. And many other people have analyzed this film to death. But I think what's most interesting about the discussions around this film is that there are really two big discussions that really came up in the aftermath of the film's release during the rise of the internet. The first was that the film's actually about Stockholm Syndrome. Yeah, that's back again. And Disney felt so challenged by this discussion of Stockholm Syndrome that it arguably changed the script for its live-action film to address Stockholm Syndrome accusations. But the second and more relevant discussion is how many people were disappointed the Beast changed back into a human and didn't stay a beast for the whole story.
Even though a lot of us were kids, we were sort of disappointed when he changed back into Adam as well. It was upsetting to see them falling in love because he was a monster, and then that's taken away from you. There's a disappointment aspect there. You're like, okay, you took the central plot of the story away from me. The point is that he's a monster. Adam's boring.
In part, I think it has to do with the familiarity of the Beast. You know, we're used to seeing the Beast one way and not this other way. So when he changes, it almost feels like being introduced to a new character, doesn't it? On the other hand, some people just really like the Beast as the Beast, and that forced them to reevaluate the perspectives of beauty. Why do we like the Beast the way he is?
A few years after that, DreamWorks Animation built effectively a cottage industry around fairy tale inversion. First with Shrek, a Beauty and the Beast story which ends with Beauty turning into a beast at the end. After that we saw Megamind, which also has a story of transformative empathy, and includes a major plot element of trying to look normal, but in the end he does get the girl despite not changing his appearance. And then there's Monsters vs. Aliens, which features
the rare female monster.
Susan's story is effectively about being comfortable in her own skin. In more recent years, we've seen the curious, unabashed rise of self-published monster erotica on places like Amazon. We also now have super popular anime and manga, Ancient Magus Bride, the author of which claims she was inspired to write it because she was disappointed with Beauty and the Beast stories, always ending with the Beast turning back into a prince at the end. And then, of course, The Shape of Water.
So I do think we see a lot of rewrites and retellings of that story specifically, and we see a lot of people who love the genre because they met it through this story for both reasons. Because you realized, hey, I want the Beast. I never wanted that to change back into a human. And just because it's such an easily relatable story.
I think this ethical humanization of the monster can be correlated to the other big story allowed to draw parallels to Beauty and the Beast, that being King Kong.
It wasn't the airplanes. It was Beauty killed the Beast.
The original King Kong and its Peter Jackson remake used the story of Beauty and the Beast as a parallel meta-narrative to the film's tale. In all three core remakes, yes, there's three, in case you forgot the 70s one, which everyone does, there's a relationship between the female lead and Kong. In the original film, Kong is an ape. It's an animal. So his attraction to the female lead is hard to pin down in human standards. But he wants her, and he wants to make sure she's safe, and wants to possess her. And it feels innocent, almost naive. In the 70s remake, I
hate that. Oh, monkey breath. I hate that. I hate that. I hate that so much. Why is she like, oh, yes, monkey breath. Oh, yes, I love your rank, monkey breath. Yeah.
There's this deeply uncomfortable eroticism where it's like, what is going on here?
Just not naive enough to believe that there's no such thing as an animal that can enjoy having sex.
You! Shut up!
But in the Peter Jackson version, it's a more playful, loving relationship. But the MonsterVerse films, which is interesting, completely remove any implication of romance and instead focus on Kong looking for kinship, either through the natives of his island or through other monsters like himself. And it's a very strong arc, yes, and it is understandable, yes, and it's humanizing the Kong, yes, but it changes the core Beauty and Beast meta-narrative that's been driving the Kong stories since the 30s.
It was Beauty killed the Beast.
And the great irony of all this is that the same year Kong Skull Island came out, which kicked off Kong's story in the MonsterVerse, The Shape of Water debuted.
And I was watching Creature from the Black Lagoon, and I saw the creature swimming underneath Julie Adams in the water, and I thought, I was overwhelmed like with the Stendhal syndrome. I thought that's the most gorgeous thing. I almost fainted, you know. It was like, I didn't know what love was, but I learned it then. Yeah. You know, and in a very silly way, I thought, because I had never seen the movie before, I thought, for sure they end up together.
The Shape of Water is undeniably Guillermo del Toro's love letter to monster romance. Much in the same way Company of Wolves reinterpreted the Little Red Riding Hood story to be an adolescent maturity story, Del Toro took from The Creature from the Black Lagoon and reframed it as a tragic romance. It's also here, most notably, that the monsters become an allegory for the outsider.
Del Toro has always had a special fascination and even sympathy for monsters, and he was well aware of the racial coding in the original Creature series, which is why The Shape of Water turns into a deliberate inversion. According to Del Toro, I feel it as an immigrant that has been received by this country, but I still feel there's this sort of demonization of the other very present. I needed to talk about the beauty of the other. It's about celebrating imperfection, celebrating otherness, falling in love with the other, you know? It's not so much tolerance as it is love.
Now, mind you, monsters have always been allegories for outsiders. Back in the old Universal days, monsters were always outsiders. Dracula is an immigrant who comes from Transylvania and the Carpathian Mountains to England, invading, essentially. Frankenstein is feared for the way he looks and the nature of his birth. And the Creature from the Black Lagoon is living peacefully in his little lagoon, almost worshipped as a god in some circles, before foreigners from the white man country come to his territory and treat him like a terrifying monster, even though he's been there for ages. King Kong is often seen by many, including Tarantino, as an allegory for the African slave trade.
Als ich in Amerika ankam, wurde ich da in Ketten zur Schau gestellt.
Ja.
Bin ich die Geschichte des Negers in Amerika?
Nein.
Also dann muss ich King Kong sein.
Is it an allegory for the African slave trade? Hard to say, but people have read that messaging into the film, and I'd be amiss not to mention it here. Marvel Comics, during the legendary Chris Claremont run of X-Men, conflated mutant kind with minority groups. Which one? Will take your pick depending on the writer. They're an oppressed minority who are targeted and demonized by society for being different inherently, especially in the graphic novel God Loves, Man Kills. And if you look at that novel, what mutant is the one that's pointed out all the time? It's Nightcrawler, the most overtly monstrous one of them all. A kind, genuine person. And to date, Nightcrawler has only had one adaptation that actually shows him in any romantic relationships, even though romance is a driving part of his character in the comics. And that one adaptation? It's X-Men Evolution. Yeah, that one is the only adaptation to date to actually explore Nightcrawler's love life. Everything else avoids it like the plague, like the cowards they are.
A lot of fantasy and sci-fi and horror these days are taking on social causes and bigger themes. And they're challenging very real world things through their stories. And monsters lend to that in a really natural way because, for better or worse, we find real life monsters in our worlds.
But Shape of Water takes this subtext and makes it text, because it does something a little different. It shows this reptile man being loved by a disabled woman, a deaf woman, who is friends with a gay man and a black woman in the peak of the conservative 50s. Its lead villain is a white representative of the government, who is rotting from the inside. It's not the first monster romance that's framed mainstream society as the villain. I mean, Beauty and the Beast did it. So did the 40s Beauty and the Beast. So did the 1930s Frankenstein film, arguably. But this one did it really well with the other elements alongside it. Real minorities running parallel to the allegorical minority story. This allowed Del Toro to anchor the narrative in real text, to show it's not just subtext, we're showing the real human story alongside the allegory. And that hammers it home pretty hard.
I think of Hell Followed With Us by Andrew Joseph White. The character who's becoming a monster is also trans, and those are entirely tied together. And I think even if you're not trans and can't relate to the character in that way, can't relate to Benji in that aspect, you see this person being driven to become a monster. Other people, society forced Benji to become a monster. And I think that that is easy to relate to, even if you don't have the same marginalization, just because of what we're all inundated with every day. And I think in some ways we want to believe that in some situations we could be the monster. We could tear it all down and burn it all up and drive the changes that we need to.
But the other huge thing, while other monster romances, even Del Toro previously did this with his monster romances like in Hellboy, they focused on the romantic side. Shape of Water focused on the romantic and erotic side as not parallel or separate, but integrated. King Kong from the 70s doesn't count. That's just weird. I'm reasonably confident that the discussions around the erotic elements in Shape of Water helped get people interested in the concept of monster romance and monster smut specifically, which is how we go from Shape of Water, which is a very classy film, to, the Minotaur book.
There is a prime beef joke to be made here. I just know it.
But while Being the Beast and Shape of Water are great, and they are really good movies, what about the rest of all this? You might say, oh, it's okay for the intelligently written stories to be made like this, but there's a lot of trash. And yeah, there is a lot of trash. And that's great, isn't it? So why do people read these stories, first off? Especially the ones that there's little artistic merit to, in terms of cultural commentary. Well, there's a few reasons why. On the one side, there's danger. The danger of romancing something so horrifying, so violent.
There's an appeal with taboo and the forbidden. So dark romance readers find a very easy transition between monster and non-monster romance within that realm. The moral grayness of it all is very appealing to a lot of readers. So many readers, even if they've never tried monster romance, love a love interest who is, misunderstood and misaligned. And monsters are just a natural extension of that. And of course, the high heat has a lot of appeal for a lot of us too. That's a big part of the draw. A lot of readers, myself included, like horror because we like to be frightened. And that extends into a lot of what I enjoy with monster romance too. Fantasy and sci-fi are so broad that it's a little harder to say, but the readers who want that soft, orc romance in their fantasy probably do find some of the same appeal as readers who want eldritch horrors throwing their characters up against walls.
Of course, this can lead to a problem. Is the danger skin deep, or is it material? Now, some works, like the recent Nosferatu film, play up monsters as monstrous. Even though there is eroticism there, the movie never avoids the fact that this is a monster with a dangerous, unending appetite that will kill you.
I am an appetite, nothing more.
However, other stories, like with Del Toro's recent adaptation of Frankenstein, we see the monster is dangerous but misunderstood. The danger isn't just from the monster, though they are very strong and potentially hazardous, but it's rather those who refuse to accept and understand them that spur on further violence. Both of these can be done very well in the right narrative. But on the other side, there's the element that we mentioned before, the outsider identifying with the monster. A recent example of this was a comic posted online depicting two monster girls, one werewolf, one vampire, picking up a unicorn for their couple, only to devour them whole.
Sometimes you see something on the internet and you just kind of go, huh, okay. And then you scroll down and you look at the comments and you realize that other people are living in a completely different reality than you.
This is the story of Easy Pickings by Moy Hiram.
This was such an interesting kind of microcosm of what happens when something made for an audience with a certain sensibility finds, for lack of a better word, regular people.
Some people found this comic cute, charming, and darkly funny. Others found it deeply disturbing because it connected the violence in the comic to some experience they had in life. This happened both in terms of the Reddit thread it was posted on, in terms of the Twitter following it was posted to, as well as people I just showed it to in general, with different reactions depending on life experience. Your interpretation of the violence will ultimately depend on what you bring to the media when examining it.
As a trans person, as disabled person, sometimes even when I look at it as an autistic person, I relate to monsters. You can see trans allegory in some of these books where we have transformations and then the way people are reacting to those transformations. I think a lot of it is about taboo, the discrimination. Monsters are kept in the shadows, on the fringes of society because they can't belong. Monsters are persecuted and misunderstood. Most people are unwilling to even attempt to understand them. People make laws for and about monsters without their input. All of that is happening to marginalized people in our world in very real ways. And we'll even hear some of the same language used to talk about us like we're monsters. So I think in very big ways, a lot of us can relate.
You built these weapons to destroy us.
Because you are afraid of our gifts. Because we are different.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
And I think that there's a physical aspect to it as well, especially if I look at it as a trans person or a disabled person. Monsters' bodies are the very first step in what makes them monsters. And so often the same things happen when people look at trans bodies and at disabled bodies.
Vassar TDS says, now that we've seen both the official tease and the leaked set photos from the live-action Zelda movie, the Hunter Schafer Brigade has come crawling back out of the woodwork. The they-thems are still furious that Hunter Schafer isn't playing Zelda, even though Hunter was never actually in the running, despite the rumors, and is a biological male being demanded for a female role.
Again, the same language is even being used. Our bodies are often considered monstrous. So we see monsters getting their chance at romance, even if it's dark and taboo and scary. And I think there is a means of seeing ourselves there that doesn't have to be negative. It surpasses being negative because we lean so far into it, if that makes sense.
The more I talked and the more I saw and the more I researched, the more it became clear that monsters are a vehicle of communication for the marginalized. Why was it that Vox Day thought that some dumb books about being pounded in the butt by billionaire dinosaurs would destroy the establishment of the Hugos? Why do so many of these grifters talk about monsters as though it's the most repulsive thing they've ever seen, while they also advocate for women to wear more sexy bikinis in video games and movies? The reason is because this is a form of violence against the establishment, a form of rebellion that is harmless with no victims whatsoever, yet so many people want to victimize those who consume and enjoy it. The one avenue for communication, the one avenue for people to be heard.
There is an increasingly vocal minority who disagreed totally with your tactics, Dr. King.
There's no doubt about that. I will agree that there is a group in the Negro community advocating violence now. I think we've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard, of the unheard, of the unheard.
However, one issue I have with this is that when we conflate the danger with the other, because this can often result in fetishization of the other. Many monster romance stories feature the monster-human relationship being seen almost as a healing factor.
In the defense of monster smut, there's an element to these monster romances and whatnot that a lot of people who hate the genre that don't read from it don't really consider, that I think is genuinely very interesting and says a lot. Even in its most surface level presentation of themes, in the vast majority of monster romances, where the dynamic is a human woman and a monster man, there is always either, like 9 times out of 10, mentions of past abuse or harm done by a human man, or a plot line that is going to happen that is active in the story regarding a harmful, abusive man, where our human woman is put in the position of needing to either be helped or rescued by, or in part healed by her monster love interest. And even in the cases of like the worst poorly done monster romances, I think this is a really compelling theme regarding monstrosity and what makes a monster, and how it has more to do with a person's choices and personality and their decisions that they make, their actions against others, than by their physical form. It's explored in Disney's Beauty and the Beast, a wildly popular monster romance for children. Beast is not the villain of the story. He's antagonistic and standoffish in the beginning, but he's not the villain. He's not even the monster, despite being the beast. The villain and the monster of the story is human man Gaston, a violently ignorant man who imprisons Belle's father and tries to murder the beast, and also tries to force Belle into marriage despite being rejected multiple times because he doesn't care to take no for an answer. This is one of the most common themes reflected in monster romances, on top of a constantly recurring focus across the board on falling in love with what's on the inside, on loving people uniquely. Even the most shallow of monster smut still has this level of depth, and I think that's kind of cool, actually.
This again, I think, reflects choices made in both Beauty and the Beast and The Shape of Water, but I don't think all those stories do it to the same degree of sophistication as those stories do. But of course, none of this is why some critics regard these stories as unethical, or the rot from which mainstream storytelling is decaying, much like how the rot from Michael Shannon's fingers in the shape of water rots his body from the inside out. There are multiple angles to this discussion. One argument here is that these novels are superficial. They provide very little in terms of literary or intellectual merit. And yeah, that's true. It's also levied towards romantasy as well, and all genres of fiction. When you look at the full of literature, most books are trash. So why can't trash exist? Why does every book have to be the best? If you allow the 900 James Patterson detective novels that all have the same basic plot, they're not intellectually stimulating. You allow those, though. That's not ruining publishing. You're celebrating those guys. Harlequin romance novels have been around for decades, if not centuries. Penny Dreadfuls have been around for decades. How are the monster romances not the modern-day equivalent of this time-honored tradition of giving people exploitative, sleazy, not necessarily super sophisticated literature? Why can't these stories be junk food, essentially? If junk food tastes good and makes you feel happy, what's wrong with them existing? A good literary diet requires moderation. There's nothing worse about reading James Patterson than there is about reading Ice Planet Barbarians. They're both equally non-intellectually stimulating, but they're fun for the reader. And by the way, nothing in monster romances is all that distinct from what's already being published in romance already. You got the same plots, the same settings, the same ideas. The only difference is there's a monster somewhere. That, and like a lot of other publishing projects done outside of mainstream publishing, a lot of marginalized people are the ones writing the stories. You find marginalized people creating these trashy romance stories for themselves because they want to see what is already in abundance elsewhere for them. And that's valid, right? But that's one thing I think that with the self-publishing world that disturbs people. There's an undercurrent of people who get mad whenever they see a work that doesn't conform to their expectations. It does not center their interests above all else. A work can have all the same plot points as a more mainstream romance project, but because it involves tentacles or claws or fur, it's suddenly invalid as an art form. Works that are overtly smutty are often given a degree of criticism, and that's fair, I get it. But they're often seen as lesser. I took a look at a thread on the book subreddit that asked, who is the author that if someone says they're my favorite author is a red flag for you? And of course, Sarah J. Maas, Colleen Hoover, and E.L. James were the most popular choices. Some said the guy who wrote Mein Kampf. Well, some controversial authors did show up, like Ayn Rand or Orson Scott Card. I didn't see many male authors known for writing smutty works. But then I saw Terry Goodkind mentioned. Terry Goodkind might be what some people think of when they think of fantasy eroticism, in some degrees. I mean, they're wrong. I mean, Kushiel's Dart by Jacqueline Carey is the work that put erotic fantasy on the map, but Goodkind is interesting because he's a male author who wrote overtly sexual books that became extremely popular in the mainstream. In the early 90s, Sword of Truth ranked alongside Game of Thrones and The Wheel of Time for being the works that helped change fantasy for the new decade. But while the books are criticized now, the turn against Goodkind started because of his terrible behavior at conventions towards fans, his elitism, his worship of Ayn Rand. The fact he sexualized women throughout his works is not why the novels were initially dismissed, though it is a point of criticism today. Which is to say, I have yet to find a male author in this thread who is criticized the same way Colleen Hoover is criticized. Or, for that matter, the Monster Smut books we saw early on are being criticized. I would argue, though, that Goodkind's books are way more perverse than many monster romance stories, even Monster Smut stories, because they focus on raw, erotic details divorced from character. With a lot of monster romance stories, the eroticism is an offshoot of the character writing.
A common theme of these stories, too, is that the women, who aren't necessarily maidens for the record, are also elevated to something more than human through their sexual encounters. They might be mystically changed by the sexual act, for example, or the big scary monster might come to respect them and serve as a powerful ally. It's a classic empowerment fantasy through sex as the catalyst.
However, it took a very long time to scroll for the author I immediately thought of with this whole example, because I went in with an author in mind. Eventually, after scrolling through the entire thread, near the bottom, I found one guy mentioning Charles Bukowski.
Inspiration from, alcohol.
Yeah.
I never write without it.
You drink a lot?
Too much.
Too much.
Bukowski is one of those writers who, every single lit class I took, there was always that one guy in the back of the class, he usually had like glasses and a scarf or whatever, who worshipped this man's writing. Usually, he thought he was enlightened in some way. He's the kind of person who would immediately dismiss all the stuff I'm talking about right now offhand because it's not real literature. And undeniably, Bukowski's a great writer. I don't like him, but he's a great writer. But he focused a lot on the perverse, the petty, the self-indulgent. But my question isn't whether or not we should question Bukowski's role in literary canon. But my question is, what about Bukowski makes him any different than the best writing of monster romance? Are you saying that Bukowski's base eroticism is somehow inherently superior to the beauty of Shape of Water, or Beauty and the Beast, or Angela Carter, or that Minotaur book? Hell, let's compare the two for a second, shall we?
What'll I do? I asked my woman. You just the bushes. It was a more crowded camp, one of those roadside machinations, tourist abounding, so I had to put on my clothing. I wasn't entirely sober. I walked along and looked at the bushes. I selected some. I got out of my blue jeans, hung them on a bush, but before I could squat, the beer shit began. Waterfalls began rolling down my legs. Wet wash of stinking beer, mildewed with improperly chewed and improperly digested food.
I feel like I'm an Athenian sacrifice. His responding chuckle was a rumble against her breasts as he covered her. You know what happened to those sacrifices, right? What did they teach you in your human schools? That minotaurs ate all of the tributes? That's true, but not in the way you think.
Not that different, huh? Both gave you a chuckle to an extent, right? They both accomplished their goals, right? They're crass, they're inappropriate, they're off-putting, they're kind of funny. They both set out for the same goal and accomplished it. Different means of reaching that same goal, but the same core goal. So how is one high art and one base trash? Most of these monster romance books you see on publishing circles, they aren't aiming to be self-important stories like Bukowski's are. But they're playing with the same blocks. Why is it that when someone plays with the toys that have existed in literature for ages slightly differently, we consider that slight difference an aberration? Anne Rice is often praised for her vampire chronicles, especially The Interview with a Vampire, but in recent years, literary critics have reevaluated her often dismissed Sleeping Beauty trilogy, a fantasy erotica story that is seen as incredibly explicit, because it is in fact incredibly explicit. That trilogy was treated like trash, just like monster romance is treated like trash today. I think it's elitism, ultimately. Things that don't conform to expectations are either treated as avant-garde or trash. I don't think monster romances ruined publishing. I think actually publishing these marginalized works is actually fixing publishing by illustrating a niche that wants to be entertained, by satisfying a hunger that was left unsatisfied, neglected even, and by offering monsters their chance to take full form.
I think if you are coming into it maybe a little bit nervous and you don't want to be like overwhelmed by the scary stuff at first, Kimberly Lemming's books are an excellent place to start. They're really fun, they're very sexy, but they're less scary. Ice Planet Barbarians absolutely has to be mentioned if we're talking about monster romances, and that's been an introduction for so many people. There is a book called Sing Me to Sleep by R.M. Virtues, which is a romance between a human and the sleep paralysis demon who is haunting that human. Love it. And it's very short, so even though you might be a little scared by it, you won't have to be scared for too long. Morgan Dante is a self-published monster romance author who writes much more toward the dark and taboo side. So if that is your thing, go check Morgan out for sure. And I am lucky enough to have edited a few books for Gem Zero, who writes very, very queer, beautiful monster romances like A Phase, Two Alphas, and Home Within Skin. And then once you find these people and you follow them, you're going to find so many other authors who are doing this, so many other stories to fall into.
For years now, monsters have been seen as allegorical to today's society. The ostracized, the put upon, the outsider. For years, stories have shown the outsider as a hazard to society, or a victim of society's cruelty. Well, now we're seeing the outsider get some love. maybe even a little more than that.
From the moment I saw her, she captured my heart.
Or you just connect the fears of pleasure and pain that horror writers like Clive Barker have for years already.
They'll never find us. Not in the whole wide world.
Because we recognize that there's an intrinsic element of the human experience and it needs addressing. Desire and terror. By connecting the two, we find something truly unique. And by the way, I once again want to remind you that yes, if you like this video, aside from liking and subscribing, please donate to Charlie's Ko-Fi or Patreon, since they helped a ton with this project. And as I said at the top of the video, every cent goes a long way to helping them with their medical payments and all that. So I thank you again once more, and I do have one last clip from Kinky right here.
Dislodging her from his side, to get up on hands and knees, and the man that she milk him like one of her French cows.